I am Claire Adamson. I am very lucky to be the MSP for Motherwell and Wishaw, which means I am the constituency MSP for Aid to the Church and Aid's headquarters in Scotland, as our building is right next to the beautiful cathedral in Motherwell. I'm speaking to you from the Scottish Parliament this evening. I hope at some point we can all return to the Scottish Parliament and be able to welcome you all in here. But you may see this a little montage that my staff got for me in my re-election, and it's got places in Motherwell and Wishaw on it, and the cathedral isn't there, but one parish, St Ignatius, is up on one of the buildings that's represented there, so it's very close to my heart in everything I'm doing, right next to my desk in the Parliament. So it's a joy to be here tonight. I have attended these events before. This is my first time hosting, which I'm delighted to do, and I just want to lay out the form of the event this evening and ensure that everyone gets to ask questions and participate where they need to. So we have a number of presentations and some videos to watch, which will be followed by a Q&A session. If I could ask people if they could use the chat function in Zoom, if they could say who they want to direct questions to and to put their questions in the chat, and we'll endeavour to get through as many of those as possible towards the end of the evening. But in the meantime, I'm happy to take questions about politics and religious freedom. It's not something I know a huge amount about, but I am very, very conscious of the Human Rights Act and the fact that religious freedom and the ability to conduct religious service is part of the Human Rights Act. And I know how much work unfortunately, often we see that religious persecution comes from other religious sects or religious areas, unfortunately, but I know that the Aid to the Church and Aid does so much to support Christians who are persecuted, unfortunately, throughout the world. So I'm happy to take questions in those areas. We have John Newton, who's the ACN's press officer, who will speak to, and then following that, all the presentations take questions on the report and the case studies. And Father Benedict Fadruccio and Lorraine McMahon, who will also be presenting this evening, are happy to take questions towards the end of the evening. So I'm really glad to be here to support ACN in action, and I'm going to move to our first speaker, who is Lorraine McMahon, and start with the ACN's Red Wednesday campaign. And Lorraine is the head of Community Outreach, England, Scotland and Wales. I'm looking to Lorraine. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining ACN on Red Wednesday and for showing an interest in our Persecuted and Forgotten report covering the period of 2020 to 2022. I would also like to thank Claire Adamson. Thank you, Claire, MSP, for sponsoring this event. We thought that maybe this year we would have been able to have this event face-to-face, but unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, we were unable to secure a space at Holyrood. So God willing, we will be able to do that next year, and we'll be able to see all your lovely faces and feel free to shake your hand. On tomorrow, we're having a drop-in session in the Scottish Parliament for MSPs. So any MSPs that are here tonight, please encourage your peers to come along, and we'll have some reports for them to take away. I would love to say that since our last Red Wednesday report, that persecution of Christians and other minority faiths had improved. But unfortunately, I cannot. Tonight, Dr. John Newton will present specific cases to you that will highlight how dangerous life is for Christians around the world. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, granddads and friends, all real people. Humans and our rights are not statistics to be ignored or debated by politicians and country leaders. We are all children of God, no matter what religion we belong to, and as such, should be left in peace to pray our way, no matter where we are in the world. Pope Francis acknowledged the number of deaths due to religious belief in our time. He said, "The age of martyrs is not yet over. Even today, we can say in truth that the Church has more martyrs now than during the first centuries." Pope Benedict in 2006 said, "I wish to make an urgent appeal to the people of God. Let every Christian be committed to tireless peacemaking and strenuous defence of the dignity of the human person and his inalienable rights. In Christ, we can find the ultimate reason for becoming staunch champions of human dignity and courageous builders of peace." As a country and as individuals, we have a duty to stand up and give a voice to the voiceless, and we can all do that. The mute button is pressed on injustice and suffering from religious persecution when money greases the hands of leaders. Greed and the display of wealth of large events diminishes the human rights of our people. Countries that are guilty of allowing the attacks to continue must be forced to see that their lack of positive action is intolerable, offensive, and a breach to human rights. Many of our leaders display indifference, including some in the UK government, but also do many of our citizens of our country and our media. Hear her cries. Break the silence. How many tags need to be attached to suffering and persecution before we stand up for faith and freedom? How many? I plead with you to turn that indifference to love. I plead with you to give a voice to the voiceless. I plead with you to petition our MPs and MSPs to take action. I plead with you to stand up for what is fundamentally right. And finally, I plead with you to help ACN break the silence of persecution of Christians and all faiths globally. Thank you. I hope you enjoy the speakers this evening, and I hope you find it really informative. Thank you very much.
Clap there. I'm sure everyone's clapping at home. Thank you very much, Lorraine, for introducing tonight. Wonderfully inspiring as always. So we move to a video. Again, research shows that Christians suffer for their faith in more countries than any other faith group. Aid to the Church in Need UK has uncovered material demonstrating the extent of this, and in their latest report, Persecuted and Forgotten, details accounts of Christians oppressed for their faith between 2020 and 2022. The report is an overview of the situation being faced by persecuted Christians across the globe, looking at 24 countries in detail, including China, Pakistan, India, Burma, Russia, much of the Middle East, and parts of Africa. There is a media silence on the reality facing Christians today: mass killings, abductions, and forced displacement. As part of the launch of this report, ACN has prepared a special video, which we will now see.
For Christians around the world, it is becoming increasingly difficult to practice and live out their faith. In many places, our brothers and sisters suffer for their love of Christ. The mission of Aid to the Church in Need is to build a bridge of love that enables the suffering and persecuted church to witness to their faith and inspire those who help them. Today, Aid to the Church in Need, or ACN, is a pontifical foundation with an ever-growing international scope, 23 national offices around the world, supporting more than 5,000 projects annually in over 145 countries. Through these projects, ACN supports the Church in her service of prayer and action to hundreds of millions of people, providing not only a timely response to urgent needs, but also a sign of solidarity with our suffering brothers and sisters in Christ. Nowadays, a huge amount of this help is needed in the Middle East, where the Christian presence is facing an existential threat. The persecution initiated by fundamentalist groups has provoked an unprecedented exodus. ACN is committed to helping these displaced Christians by providing concrete answers to the strong hope and faith that they keep in the middle of this devastating situation. There and throughout the whole world, ACN helps the construction and reconstruction of church buildings, houses of God worthy of the sacramental life, and where Catholic communities gather to worship, pray, and be strengthened in faith. In fulfilling this work, an essential part of ACN's mission is to inform about this hidden suffering of Catholics in the world. ACN produces and distributes internationally 2 publications. The Religious Freedom in the World Report, an analysis addressing the threat to religious liberty in 196 countries, and the Persecuted and Forgotten Report, an assessment and classification of those countries where Christians are persecuted and oppressed for their faith. In a world weighed down by unspeakable suffering, one of the most important needs is prayer. ACN supports contemplative sisters, allowing them to open a powerful wellspring of God's love through their prayers for humanity. Particularly in isolated areas, the active sisters are those who take care of those in spiritual or material need. ACN supports more than 12,000 religious sisters each year, helping them fulfill their vocation. ACN also contributes to those priests who keep the faith alive in their communities, but yet live in poverty. Annually, 43,000 of them receive mass stipends from ACN benefactors, who request masses for their intentions. These testimonies inspire courageous young men to offer their lives to serve the Church, but in poor areas, answering this call is a difficult journey. To alleviate this need, every year, ACN supports the formation of approximately 13,000 of these future priests worldwide. Where the faithful cannot go to the Church, ACN helps the Church go to the faithful by providing the necessary transportation for priests, religious sisters, and catechists to minister in the most remote areas. To help teach the gospel, ACN supports the translation, printing, and distribution of more than 51 million copies of the Child's Bible in 190 different languages. For many, this colourfully illustrated book is the only one they will ever possess. Aid requests come not only for books, but also for Catholic radio and television stations, as well as for the training of qualified staff who are supported by ACN to help spread the gospel in the media. The cross, the sign of God's promise, has guided the pastoral work of Aid to the Church in Need. The vertical beam unites us to God's love, and the horizontal beam in extending this love to our brothers and sisters. It is the cross that has also inspired ACN benefactors to help those who are unable to carry their crosses alone. They are being tested in faith. We are being tested in love.
Thank you so much for that wonderful video. that sets out the challenges that face the Christians across the world and others of minorities across the world today. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. John Newton, who is the Senior Press Officer for ACN UK, and part of his role includes researching, writing, and editing ACN reports, such as the ones featured in the video, Persecuted and Forgotten, and the Religious Freedoms of the World, as well as many others. John has travelled extensively throughout the Middle East and was one of the first to raise the plight of Christian refugees from Syria and Iraq who were being ignored by the United Nations. His reports have provided a voice for persecuted Christians during dangerous times of war, humanitarian need, and politically difficult circumstances. And tonight, John will talk you through the 2022 report, Persecuted and Forgotten, and hopefully inspire us all to take action. John.
Thank you. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church of St. Mary of Zion in Aksum, northern Ethiopia, is believed to be the resting place of the Ark of the Covenant. This is not just a pious flight of fancy. There is evidence that suggests it might have been brought to Ethiopia by a group of Jews who fled Jerusalem after the destruction of the city and the First Temple around 600 BC. But regardless, the church where it is believed to be housed is one of the most sacred sites for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. In November 2020, Eritrean troops supporting the Ethiopian government's attempts to quell separatist rebels entered the church compound and killed around 750 people. That's about 3/4 of those who were in the complex at the time. These were not the first or the last atrocities that Eritrean troops were accused of. Throughout 2021, monasteries were looted, priests and monks were assaulted, nuns were raped. No one has been brought to trial for these crimes. Patriarch Matthias of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church described these crimes as a genocide, an attempt to wipe out the local Christian community. The term genocide has also been used to describe atrocities elsewhere in Africa. In Nigeria, Christians have suffered from repeated attacks by the jihadist group Boko Haram, also known as ISWAP, in the northeast. Boko Haram is an extremist Islamist group with links to ISIS or Daesh or Islamic State or whatever one wants to call that extremist organization that caused such havoc in Iraq. Boko Haram has publicly stated that its aim is to drive out Christians and to establish a caliphate. It must be stressed that it is not just Christians who have suffered at their hands, but arguably Christians have borne the brunt of the attacks, as indeed they have in Nigeria's Middle Belt. Ongoing attacks on villages and rural settlements in the Middle Belt have now left more than 2 million people displaced. The attacks by militant members of the Fulani community, sometimes referred to as bandits, have a long history dating back to conflicts between members of the Muslim-majority nomadic Fulani herder community and farmers from both Christian and Muslim groups that goes back to the 1970s. But today's conflict has grown far beyond these roots. It has taken on a markedly sectarian turn. Speaking to ACN earlier this year, Archbishop Matthew of Kaduna said, "In the last 10 years, it has taken a different dimension also. The herdsmen used to be armed with sticks and bows. Now they have AK-47s. As part of the ongoing attacks, churches are regularly targeted. There is growing evidence that these Fulani bandit groups are working with Boko Haram, receiving training and logistical support from the ISIS-affiliated organization. All this suggests that at least some of these groups have become radicalized. The result for the people of Nigeria is an endless litany of attacks in both the North and Middle Belt regions. These attacks are now so commonplace that they barely make the news outside of the country. To give just a few examples of the sort of attacks they have suffered, on Sunday, the 26th of September, 2021, 49 people were killed in Kaura local government area, where multiple attacks occurred on Christian majority communities in Kaduna State. On Thursday, the 24th of March this year, 100 people were abducted in Kaduna State as part of nighttime attacks on 10 Christian majority settlements. Around 50 people were killed during the raids. Women and children were among the dead. And on Sunday, the 5th of June, 41 people, including children, were killed when armed men fired randomly into the congregation at St. Francis Xavier's Church in Ondo State. It was Pentecost Sunday. It was one of the biggest gatherings in the church of that year. The attack in Ondo State did make global news, but only because it was the first attack in the state in southwest Nigeria on a church. Such attacks have moved further south for the first time, and that was newsworthy. It was the first attack that far south. It was the first attack in Ondo State. But the numbers of those being killed in Nigeria have ceased to make any impact on global media. It's just another massacre, and no one cares about another few dozen people being killed in Nigeria. It happens too regularly. Bishop Jude, whose diocese that occurred in, will say more about the attack later tonight. But on that very same day that St. Francis Xavier's Church was attacked, 2 church buildings belonging to the Evangelical Church Winning All were razed in southern Kaduna. 32 people were reported dead after attacks on 4 villages. About 150 motorbikes, each carrying 3 men armed with AK-47s, descended on those villages, and a helicopter also carried out aerial strikes. These are not attacks by disgruntled herders. These are attacks by an organized force. According to one analysis, more than 7,600 Christians were killed between January 2021 and June 2022. Let us take a moment to pause and let those figures sink in. 7,600 Christians were killed over 18 months. On average, 10 Christians died every day during that period. And despite the state pledging to bring perpetrators to justice, very few people have been brought to trial for these crimes. And sometimes it seems as though the state is complicit in the oppression of Christians. Let us move to Pakistan, where Christians face very different problems. The world has heard of Asia Bibi, the first woman to be sentenced to death for blasphemy in the country, but few have heard of Shagufta Kausar. Along with her husband, Shafqat Masih, she was arrested in July 2013 for allegedly sending offensive text messages about the Muslim prophet Muhammad. At the time of their arrest, the couple were living with their 4 children in the compound of their local church in the Punjab, Pakistan. They were far from well off. Shafqat was paralyzed and unable to walk. He made money by repairing mobile phones. It didn't make much, but it brought in a little income. Shagufta had a job at the local Christian high school, but money was very tight, and they had been given lodging by the church because they wouldn't otherwise have been able to afford to shelter themselves and feed their families. Then, in July 2013, several police vans arrived at the church compound. Dozens of officers got out of the vans and entered their home. They raided the house and arrested the couple on charges of blasphemy. An offensive message about the Muslim prophet Muhammad had allegedly been traced to Shagufta's SIM card, but it was written in English, a language neither of them knew. Shafqat confessed to the crime whilst in detention, but he only confessed after he was told by police officers that Shagufta would be raped in front of him if he refused to confess. I don't believe that threatening a disabled man with something so horrific is standard procedure in Pakistan, but this is only the first of a number of irregularities which haunted the whole case and should have led to it being investigated. According to Shagufta, neither she nor her husband were allowed to testify at their trial. In fact, Shagufta told ACN through a translator, our lawyer was not allowed to complete his closing arguments, and neither of us were heard. I fainted when I heard this judgment of death. The couple spent 7 years on death row. During that time, they were in separate cells. ACM was told that Shagufta spent the latter part of her sentence in the same cell which had formerly been occupied by Asia Bibi. That one cell has housed 2 women, both of whom were sentenced to death, neither of whom were ultimately found to have committed the crime that they were convicted of. Shagufta and Shafgat were continually worried about their family members. Their family had to keep changing their locations, going to new addresses as extremists were hunting for them, and this included their children, the youngest of whom was 5. Shagufta told ACN, despite all these frightening nightmares, I never lost hope or my faith. I prayed daily without fail. I read the Bible and sang psalms and hymns in Urdu and Punjabi, and I took great comfort in that. I never lost faith and hope that since my husband and I were innocent, my ever-loving Lord Jesus Christ, who defeated death and rose from the dead on the 3rd day, would set us free and raise me up from death. Several times I was told that if I converted to Islam, my death sentence would be turned into life in prison and that eventually I would be released. I always said no. The risen Lord Jesus Christ is my life and saviour. Jesus Christ sacrificed his life for me, though I am a sinner. I will never, ever change my religion and convert to Islam. I would rather be hanged than deny Jesus Christ. Her faith was the one thing she could cling to during the darkest of days. And it's worth saying that her statement that she would rather be hanged than deny Jesus, it reflects the choice that was actually presented to her. She was being sentenced to death by hanging and was told that she could avoid that by converting, and she refused. In May 2022, their appeal was finally heard, and their original sentence was overturned. The case was found to be unsound, and they were both released. But they were unable to remain in Pakistan. They had to leave the country, and they found asylum in Europe. Many others are not so lucky. There are still dozens of prisoners on death row for blasphemy in Pakistan, and many others are living in hiding. Mera Shabazz managed to escape from her abductor after she was kidnapped in 2020. The 14-year-old had been seized on the streets. She was gang raped, forced to marry her abductor, forced to change her religion. As I say, she managed to get away, but she has now spent more than 2 years in hiding. Like Shagufta's family, she is afraid of reprisals from extremists. Only in June this year, the family told ACN that men had again been going from door to door trying to track Mera down. ACN met with the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, I should say the then Home Secretary, twice to highlight her case, but nothing happened as a result of those meetings. Priti Patel was very sympathetic. She gave a ready ear. She seemed to understand the plight of this girl, but nothing happened. Mera still lives in fear. Mera still lives in hiding. In neighbouring India, the Christian community is also in the line of fire. Last year, more than 500 incidents of violence and hate against Christians were recorded. Many of these attacks were driven by allegations of conversion. This is because much of the anti-Christian rhetoric which fuels attacks dwells on the ideas that Hindus are on their way to being outnumbered in India. This is a neurotic fear prompted by census data showing that for the first time since the founding of modern India in 1947, Hindus have dropped below 80% of the population. And yet, Christianity has remained stable. There is no sign of a vast number in the growth of Christians. And this hysteria, and I don't think hysteria is too strong a word, has seen nationalist groups whipping up hate against minorities and often facilitating anti-conversion laws which play into attacks on minority groups, including Christians. In December 2021, St. Joseph's School in Madhya Pradesh state was attacked by a mob of around 500 Hindu extremists. They threw stones, they smashed up school buildings with iron rods. The incident was prompted by accusations posted on YouTube that the school was converting its Hindu students. The post showed photos of 8 Catholic children receiving confirmation and First Holy Communion at the parish church. But according to the poster, it alleged to show the conversion of Hindu pupils at the school. School principal Brother Anthony said, "We requested the police for protection, and they assured us that the mob would only shout a few slogans and disperse peacefully, but even then they would give protection, but the police failed to show up." In the event, the vandals attacked the school, destroying property for more than an hour before police finally intervened. Madhya Pradesh is one of the states in India with a law prohibiting religious conversion. And this April, on Holy Thursday, 55 Christians were charged with illegal conversions in Uttar Pradesh state. A 200-strong mob stopped members of the Evangelical Church of India from leaving the grounds of their church after a service for the beginning of the Easter Triduum. When police arrived, they questioned the Christians for 3 hours before charging 55 people and taking them to the station. 26 men were eventually arrested and kept overnight in cells. The arrests occurred after an office holder in a nationalist group told police that 90 Hindus had been illegally converted to Christianity. The following day, the 26 men who were arrested were taken to court. 9 of them were bailed, while the rest were remanded in custody before all being released on Holy Saturday. All conversion charges were withdrawn by police, but those 26 men were then charged with violations of the penal code. No member of the mob was arrested. Church leaders said that nationalists, quote, portrayed the service as a religious conversion activity, and those who had attended it were harassed for no fault of their own. The nationalists seized on anti-conversion legislation as a pretext to drive the persecution of the churches. An evangelical church in one state, a Catholic school in another, both are targets. And such problems are by no means restricted to India. In March of this year, a 600-strong mob, including around 60 Buddhist monks, entered the grounds of Mercygate Chapel in Southern Province, Sri Lanka. They demanded that the community close the building and cease all activities. The pastor was threatened with death if he continued to lead worship at the site. Nor should we end without considering China. Again, we see one group, the Chinese Communist Party, imposing its views and vision on all citizens. Dissent is not permitted. In May of last year, Bishop Joseph Zhang Weizhu was arrested along with 10 priests and 10 seminarians. Their crime was running a seminary outside of state control. They were passing down the faith to the next generation of priests, teaching them the belief of the church without Communist Party interference. They were training these future priests to minister to the faithful, but they weren't allowed to. They were arrested. The seminarians were returned to their families after being threatened with jail if they continued to study outside of state-approved structures, by which is meant those controlled by the Communist Party. The priests were sent to legal education centres to undergo re-education and were then released. They had to learn how to think properly. They had to learn to think along the lines that the Communist Party wanted them to think along, not along the lines that their faith and their conscience dictated that they should think along. And what of Bishop Joseph? The latest information we have is that he is still in detention 18 months on. When a country prescribes what you can believe, how you can believe, and punishes you for dissenting, you know that there are very serious problems with the state. Now, those are just a handful of the cases which we looked at as we carried out our research into the situation of Christians in a number of countries of key interest for our Persecuted and Forgotten report. Analysing and weighing up the evidence, we drew out a few main findings, some of which I don't think will come as any surprise given the stories I've already related this evening. In Africa, we found that the situation of Christians had worsened in all the countries we reviewed. In particular, there was evidence of a sharp increase in genocidal violence from militant non-state actors, particularly from jihadist groups. And increasing militant activity has caused very serious problems in countries such as Mali and Nigeria. In the Middle East, continuing migration deepened the crisis threatening the survival of some of the world's oldest Christian communities, such as Syria and Iraq, and we saw that highlighted in the video, which we saw just earlier. In Asia, state authoritarianism has been a critical factor causing worsening oppression against Christians in Burma, China, Vietnam, and elsewhere in the region. And in other parts of Asia, such as India and Sri Lanka, religiously linked nationalism has driven increasing violence against Christians. And it is nationalist groups who are driving it in those countries. All of this shows that around the world, Christians are still being persecuted and oppressed. Our hope is that the Persecution and Forgotten report will ensure that they are not forgotten, and that it might give a hearing to their voices, and that the voices of those which otherwise remain silent might actually be heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. John, for that wonderful presentation of the report and very sobering thoughts and themes coming through in that, and very moving and thought-provoking for all of us. Our next agenda item is a video message from the Most Reverend Dr. Jude Arogundade. I hope I pronounced that okay. Dr. Jude was the Bishop of Ondo, Nigeria, since last November. And this is the same diocese where gunmen killed over 40 parishioners and injured 78 in St. Francis Xavier's Church in Owo in June 2022. He previously served as a parish priest in upstate New York, and on September the 11th, 2001, when a pair of hijacked airliners brought down the Twin Towers, he was in his parish of Our Lady of Mount Carmel Catholic Church in Elmsford. He was close and by a mile-square village in Westchester County. He could see the dark plumes of ash and smoke rising from ground zero in Lower Manhattan. And please play the Most Reverend Dr. Jude's video.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jude Ayodeji Arogundade. I am the Bishop of the Catholic Diocese of Ondo, Nigeria. I'm here today to speak to you about what happened in my diocese on Pentecost Sunday when some group of terrorists came to St. Francis Xavier Church and shot at almost everybody. But at the end of the day, They killed 41 worshippers in our church and wounded 78 others. And to this day, we are still nursing the wounds caused by these terrorists. So please, do whatever it takes to support the cause of bringing solace and consolation to our brothers and sisters out there who are being persecuted wherever in the world. I thank you for coming here today to participate in this Red Wednesday, in which Aid to the Church in Need is shedding light on the persecuted Christians around the world. I am personally grateful to you, and the church is also grateful to you. And your coming here today is so reassuring that you are ready to support the cause of bringing relief to those who suffer for the sake of their faith. Not just in Nigeria, but all over the world. And no one have to suffer because of his or her faith. So please, those who have not signed the petition, please try as much as possible to do so. And those who wants to bring dear ones and friends to be part of this beautiful mission of bringing relief and joy to those who suffer, please do so, and it will be well appreciated. Thank you so much for coming. May God bless all of you, and I bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
What a beautifully presented video of such an awful event from the Bishop, and again so thought-provoking, and a reminder that, you know, atrocities and terrorism can happen anywhere in the world, and we must do everything we can. So I hope that we will be able to share that link for the petition, and I'll be certainly copying it to be able to share in my networks and on social media. So thank you again to the Bishop. Our final speaker this evening is Father Benedict Fadujo, who is a Nigerian priest from the Diocese of Ondo. Nigeria is now based at St. Lawrence Church in Edinburgh. Father Benedict has close connections with the parish of St. Francis Xavier, which we have just heard about in the video. And I would like to invite him to speak to the group this evening. Father Benedict.
Good evening, everybody. And as I've been introduced, that's who I am, actually. I was born here in Croydon, but did travel back to Nigeria with my parents and lived in Nigeria from primary 3 all the way through till I had my ordination, which must have been through secondary school days and also seminary days in the major seminary where I studied philosophy and theology. Basically in Nigeria as a priest, I worked in various capacities, most especially as a youth chaplain. And this gave me the opportunity to really go around the diocese from time to time to meet with young people, to hold World Youth Days in different parishes. And St. Francis was part of the churches where we held World Youth Day celebrations. It is a very big church. It is a massive church. I think the capacity should be like 1,000. It's 1,000 sitting capacity. It actually rivals our cathedral in terms of size. I'm not sure about the population as Catholics, but in terms of the size of the church and the activities of parishioners, they are graded as what we call grade A in the diocese, and that ranks with Cathedral, ranks with St. Matthew's, Ondo, ranks with St. Patrick's, Ondo, ranks with St. Gregory's Ikare, ranks with Mary Queen of Angels, Akure, Mary Help of Christians, Akure. So these are the major, what you'll call major churches, and it seems to be the major church in Ordinary. As far as I know, growing up in Nigeria, when I was young, there wasn't much. I mean, I lived in the Southwest. There wasn't much stress about persecution of Christians in the South, though we used to hear of riots in the North, you know, when Muslims would go out and kill Christians. I think one happened in 1982. I was basically too young to even know what was going on then. But there were so many stories like that, that we always knew that any little thing that people misinterpret in the North, it is an you know, like a kind of an outburst of Muslims against Christians, and the killing goes unabated in the North. You hardly see people being brought to book. This hasn't just started today. It has been in Nigeria for time immemorial, that when there is a religious crisis and the Muslims kill Christians, the government might come up and say, oh, this act is so bad and this, and that's the end to it. People are hardly arrested. And even if they are, after a few weeks or months, you don't hear any story about it again. It's just dead silence. But growing up as a kid, gradually we got to know that Nigeria at some point was incorporated into the Organization of Islamic Conference or Nations or something like that. And we knew that the likes of Cardinal Okoji Olubumi in Lagos fought strenuously alongside other Christians to hold the then military junta called Babangida to withdraw Nigeria's membership from that group. Now, this went on and on because they said it is a country that is, you can't say the majority Muslims, neither the majority Christians, but you can't drag our country into such an organization without the consent of the people. Fast forwarding and coming down to maybe the year when the military eventually handed over again to the democratically elected government, which was in 1999, the constitution drawn up by the military guys in Nigeria was basically, it wasn't the voice of the people. It was just a few in the military who drew up this constitution that they said, we the people of Nigeria. So, but the reality is that we knew, and everybody knew, that that constitution didn't represent Nigeria. Twice or three times, the governments of the day had tried to call for what you call a confab, where you get more people to come together to talk about a constitution and draft it, but such things never saw the light of day. Eventually, the current president, as we have it, became the president. But before him, Boko Haram had been in existence under Jonathan Ebele. That's the previous president of the state. The killings were going on in the northeastern part, which was largely evangelized by what we know today as the Augustinian Irish missionaries from the 1940s all the way up. In the Southwest, it was the Society of Missionaries for Africa who actually did in the Southwest. Also part of the North was the Dominicans. In the Southeast was more of the Holy Ghost Fathers and also the SMA Fathers. And so that's why Nigeria has a great bond with Ireland in terms of the Catholicism, in terms of our Christian heritage. But over and over, the concept of picking people who have offended and let them, be punished according to law or face the full wrath of the law in Nigeria has been a story that you hardly know the end of the story. It doesn't really happen. So, but in 2000 and I think that was 2015, 2015 or thereabout year, Buhari became the president of the country. Now, he said, we are going to make sure Boko Haram does not do this again to us, and so on and so forth. But I just tried to look up again to see the sequence of Buhari himself. And in 2001, at an Islamic seminar in Kaduna, Buhari was given an opportunity to choose between Nigeria's secularism and fundamentalist Islam. This is what he said: I will continue to show openly and inside me the total commitment to Sharia movement that is sweeping all over Nigeria. He then added that, God willing, we will not stop the agitation for total implementation of Sharia in Nigeria. Buhari has been an advocate of Sharia courts in Nigeria. And even when the killings have happened and all that, what happens next is that he comes on the television and says, we condemn this, and that's it. In fact, sometimes he doesn't say a word. He might pop up maybe like 3 days after. The one that happened in Owo, the APC party, the party he belonged to, was holding a kind of a conference in Abuja when this thing happened. And our state governor is part of the APC party members. The governor flew down immediately. Buhari did not cancel the meeting. They continued with the meeting. And then the vice president came some days, maybe 2 or 3 days after. The fact in Nigeria is that people are never held responsible. So that lets us understand that when you have these connections, dotting it all the way to the Constitution of 1999, you would see that some people are holding Nigeria by force, controlling the minds and the lives of people. And so it becomes difficult that even our judiciary tends not to be really independent of the federal government or the presidency. So we're kind of in this situation where there isn't really that separation where people know they can get justice when something goes wrong. Nigeria is a country where many things are wrong, but when you look at it topping the list, religious persecution seems to be at the top. In 2020, what you call the Lekki massacre in Nigeria, till date, Buhari, even when the Lagos government instituted what we call a panel of inquiry, and the panel of inquiry came out with its findings and actually condemned the federal government's actions and said people were killed, the federal government denied killings in Lagos. In other words, it's been that the federal government itself is complicit in the whole problem, because the federal government has not, for once, supported the idea of having a state police. So we don't have state police in Nigeria. We don't have local police. We only have what you call the federal police, and they are responsible only to the president. So even when the state governor talks about security in his state and all that, there is still that problem of the police in the state taking orders from the federal government, and so does the military. Now, within the Southwest, they organized and had what you call vigilante groups, which is more like a little bit of a policing group and all that. The federal government, through the Attorney General, was trying to make sure it doesn't come to fruition until the state governments had to pass it through their own local, what you call state House of Assemblies, and that was able to come to fruition. Or well, where this whole thing happened is the hometown of the state governor. These are just thoughts of people, and this is just a theory. I don't believe it's true. But because he has been at the forefront of having state police, letting people have a right to their own security, striking at the heart of his own town also sends a message, people feel, to him, that we will strike your city and nothing will happen. But more so, the incursion into the Southwest is showing that nowhere is actually safe anymore. Growing up, when we see the Hausas or the what you call the Fulanis with their cows and all that, we used to see them with sticks, and they just, you know, I would say Sanu, and we just greet them, and they were very kind. But as you said, the Archbishop of Kaduna says, now we see them carrying AK-47. In fact, when you see herds of animals passing by your house now, you don't say much because you're not sure what these guys can do. So we feel it is more like an organized group of people who have constantly and consistently hit hard at other religions, suppressing them. Let me give you a little bit into Nigeria itself. 1914 was when the country Nigeria came together, the Northern Protectorate, the Southern Protectorate. But under the British rule then, in the Northern Protectorate, it was what they called indirect rule. In the South, it was direct rule. In other words, in the North, they were ruling through the emirs or the sultan. They didn't have direct contact with the people. And the emirs and the sultans made sure that Western education was not part of the game in the North. So if you get to the North, you have millions of children who are actually not educated. They go through Islamic schools, and that's the end of the story. In the South, there is what you call the direct rule, where Europeans and missionaries had direct access to the people, to the king, established schools, and so on and so forth. And because education is growing in the South, many Christians have a right to question things when it's not right at all. The North, they don't. They follow what they're told to do. A Muslim in the North would believe God has created him poor so that you, the rich, can go to heaven. So that means you would keep on giving him money so that your heaven can be assured. Simple things that makes them, and we're talking about over 14, 15 million children in the North that has no education. The previous president tried to create these schools. I think after he left, these schools went into extinction. Some of them are still there, but many are not. Even in the North, there was a king who was deposed, Sanusi, who was a Muslim, but kept on talking against the Northerners. Before they knew what was happening, he was removed as the emir, and he's no longer there. Many people and prominent leaders that you can listen to would also be Bishop Matthew Hassan Kuka, the Bishop of Sokoto. Every December the 25th, the nation always waits for his message, and he really goes out against the federal government, not for just attacking the federal government, but actually using facts and figures to project his views. I knew Father Andrew at Bayomi long before he became a priest, because I served in his parish in Nigeria, and he was an altar server then when I was in his parish. And it was actually from his parish that I came to the United Kingdom. The day the bomb blast happened, I finished Mass here, and I was trying to run off to give communion to people around. And my cousins kept sending me messages saying, Father, have you checked Twitter? There is an attack against our parish, and it seems really bad. So I did check, and I started seeing some videos, and I started sending messages to Father, but because what we heard was the priest was killed. So I kept sending messages to him, but also the parish priest, Father Anna de Vicent. We went to the same secondary school together. So when I was in my final year, I think he was in year 2 or year 1. And I kept on trying to reach out. Unfortunately, I couldn't. Later in the evening, Father Andrew sent a message, I'm alive. I was taking people to the hospital. That's why you couldn't get through to me. I tried to call, and I noticed that it wasn't, I mean, the 3 priests there, I spoke to the 3 of them. The one in the middle, who was Father Charles, couldn't get a sentence through. He was always crying because he came into church to assist Father Andrew to give communion. I think he left the church back to the presbytery when he heard the gunshots. So, and that was when he was also making efforts to call the police. The police is just like 5 minutes drive to St. Francis Xavier's Church. Or the police didn't turn up until like 20 minutes after the gunshots. I would say that the federal government is complicit. It's unless we're just trying to, to hide behind one finger, and that's hypocrisy in itself. And I believe that until Nigeria starts taking leadership seriously, we're going to constantly have this problem of people getting into government through the back doors. Just to cap this up, most of those in the senior key roles of the federal government, and especially in the security positions, are from the north. They're Muslims. So it's obvious that these things happen and nobody holds them responsible. When you talk about employment, it's the same way. There must always be preference to the north. And go through history, when you look at Ahmadu Bello's statements and other people like that, there was that idea of preferring after the Muslims is the expatriates before you even think of the Southerners. Even in a Muslim mosque, once a Northerner is there, a Southerner cannot lead. So in my state, where you have a central mosque, where some of the Southerners who are Muslims, no Northern Muslim will go to the Southern mosque. They prefer to have their own mosque, which is outside the major mosque. So that's a problem, that it is about something of Northern superiority over the South, of Islam above Christianity. Everything Northerner must be protected against the South, who are seen as al-Kafiri, which means pagans. And so, but growing up as a kid, I enjoyed my Christian life. I went to 2 secondary schools, St. Joseph's College, which was run by the De La Salles, and then I went to Sacred Heart Minor Seminary, and we had no problem. St. Joseph's was more of many other religions because it was a public school, but the Sacred Heart was a private school, and it was basically more Catholics. But I didn't have a problem at all. But gradually, as you grow up, you start seeing the loopholes in all the problems in Nigeria. And you can see that it's a kind of a systematic way in which a group of people have held on to Nigeria and the future of the people without allowing them to have a voice or a say in their own lives. I think I've covered what I need to say. And thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Benedict. That was really, really informative. I have a Nigerian community in my constituency who are not Catholic but are Christian, and I celebrated Nigeria Day with them in a celebration in the summer, and it brought home to me that for me in Scotland, with just 5 million people here in a tiny, tiny country in Northwest Europe, you're so far away. But I can't get my head around how huge your country is. I think it's 56 million people, and one of the biggest populations in the world in Nigeria. So it's an incredibly complex country, and with a complex history as you laid out there. So that ends our presentations for this evening. So we're now open to a Q&A session. So if you could ask questions in the chat, and if you could tell me who you'd like to direct them to, and I'll try and get through as many as possible. There are a couple of questions in already for John Newton. So Dr. John, I was wondering, so one of the questions is about why we don't take more direct action in Scotland to protest perhaps outside the consulates in Edinburgh of some of the countries who we believe are complicit and whose leadership is allowing some of this to happen, and what thoughts there are about that. I'm very familiar with the peace and justice movement in Scotland, and I regularly go to Dungavel to protest outside the Westminster migration centre that's there. But just a thought about whether that would be an option, and also a question on the media reaction to the report. There's a lot going on in the media today, particularly UK-wise, but we obviously have the war in Ukraine. But I do remember that in the past, some of Age of the Church and Needs reports been covered on national news, and I just wonder if you could pick up those 2 points for us, Dr.
Certainly, and if I can answer the questions the other way around and start with the media. And so we have been in contact with all the major media organs in the UK. We have had some interest, and in fact, Bishop Jude was speaking on BBC Radio 4 last Sunday morning, and Arise News, which possibly isn't a familiar name to most people, but if you go down to your Freeview news channels, you'll find it there along with Sky, along with BBC, and along with all the others. They actually had a very lengthy piece with Bishop Jude the day after we launched the report last Wednesday. And so there have been 2 hits with the mainstream media, and there's also been a number of hits with smaller local and specialist media outlets as well. So we have knocked on doors, and some of those doors have opened. With regards to knocking on the doors in terms of organising protests and standing outside of embassies and so on and so forth, it's something I think we've been sometimes reluctant to do, purely because we know that sometimes the perception that gets back to some of these countries can be very negative. I remember 13 years ago when we were looking at the possibility of doing some sort of protest in conjunction with others outside the Pakistan High Commission in London. And we spoke to the bishops. In fact, I spoke to Bishop Sebastian Shaw at the time. And I'll never forget him saying, he said, be very, very careful. He said, there is a great perception in Pakistan that Britain is a Christian country. If this is seen as Christians criticizing Muslims, it will create more problems, more tensions, and more attacks on our churches. Whatever you do, don't let this be seen as Christians attacking Islam. And we took that very seriously. We were at the time, as I say, working with other groups, some of which were Muslim groups, some of which were interfaith groups. And we made sure that the way that we organised that event outside the Pakistan High Commission didn't give any impression that it was just Christians attacking Islam, and that message couldn't possibly be taken away from that. But if you ensure that you go into the politics of these things and that you're not going to be, setting off incendiaries back in those countries and making life worse, then I think that there can be a value to direct action. It's about choosing the cause very carefully, ensuring with those on the ground in the country that it's the right cause and the right thing to be doing. And then it's just a case of the logistics of putting it together.
Thank you. That was very helpful. There is another question in for Father Benedict about how do the Catholics and other Christians in the south of Nigeria view the north? And do they send missionaries? Is there any interchange at all by religious between the north and the south?
Basically, even beyond religion, there are loads of Southerners living in the north. And I think that's why they are, many of them are attacked when the first-hand, religious disturbances happen in the north. And even in the north, because we're always given this impression that it is north dominated by Islam. That's not true. There are loads of places in the north that are Christian dominated. Like if you get to Kaduna, Kaduna North is Muslim dominated. Kaduna South is Christian dominated. If you go to Kano, the St. Louis sisters had a St. Louis secondary. In fact, the first St. Louis secondary school in Nigeria was in Kano. The second one was in Ondo Diocese. And then I think the third was in Jos, and then it moved around. But then the moment Islams were in charge of, you know, the government, they stopped the expansion of Christian building churches or having more schools. So it wasn't about the idea that the North had no one or had nothing. They have indigenous Christian bodies and groups. Many of them are Catholics, Baptists, Equa, Anglicans, Methodists, and so on. So the concept of, because even the whole of Africa as it is still viewed as a missionary land where, you know, where all churches, I mean, the Vatican still sees us that way. And that's why Europe and the rest of the world still supports Africa financially, even through studies, building churches and other things, and exactly what you're doing here. So the Southerners see the North as no problem at all. And I think many moderate Muslims in the North don't see the South as a problem. It is about the extremists, these fanatics and extreme guys who really want to see the concept of us above the rest. Now, there have been some situations, though they may not be Catholics, but I noticed in Abuja at some time, there was a lady evangelizer from the Redeemed Christian Church who was just going about preaching, and she was beheaded in broad daylight in Abuja. Nothing happened. In Sokoto, that was, I think early this year, or was it last year, a lady in school was burnt to death because they said she blasphemed against the Prophet Muhammad. Till date, none of the killers have been picked up. So I don't think that the Southerners see the North as a problem, and the North in itself has a large number of Christians. And to be honest, if there is a new census in Nigeria, which I hope they're trying to have, they will be sure and shocked if it is not rigged in favor of the North, that's always done, that actually the population in Nigeria would be 55% Catholics, 55% Christians, 45% Muslims. Because there is conversion going on in the North. It happens. It's nothing new. And sometimes too, those who become priests in the North, some of them are actually from Eastern origin, the eastern part of Nigeria, the Igbos. But that doesn't mean that you don't have Northerners who are Christians or who are priests in the North. There are many of them also in the North. So the idea of exchange of missionaries, I don't think that's a core problem. I think the core problem still remains that there is a group of people who actually have held back the North to know that there is something beyond just being held back by religious fundamental views, and allowing them to have a more broader view about what Islam is about, rather than having it as a religion. Many of them in the North see it as an ideology. And I think that's why the concept of killing or maiming a Christian is making more sense to them, because if you believe that it's a religion and that God is the final judge, you wouldn't place yourself as a judge in place of God.
I think that's really interesting to hear that answer. There is another comment in, but I think we've run right up against time, but it is about suggesting that we don't need the permission of the bishops, that we have to, we can just go and raise awareness. I have some sympathy with that, but I know, having worked in politics for a long time, how delicate these situations can be. And I would just open up the offer. There are many cross-party groups in the Parliament, including a cross-party group in Pakistan. And maybe what we should do is have some of the concerns that have been aired tonight at that cross-party group working collegiately with the Pakistani community in Scotland to raise awareness of that, which I'm happy to try and facilitate going forward. So we're just about right out of time. I note that the petition link has been put up and information on how to get copies of the report on the chat. And I'm finally just going to hand over to Claire, who's going to do the call to action following tonight's event.
Thank you, Claire. So this evening, first of all, to say thank you for joining us. I'm the events manager for Aid to the Church in Need in Scotland, and the main principle of my role is to really reach out to our Scottish schools, our universities, our parishes and our benefactors and invite them to engage with the work of ACN through our campaigns, such as Red Wednesday, which you've all joined us for this evening, and our other events that we hold throughout the year. Central to our work are three principles, and they were referred to in the video we heard earlier: prayer, information and action. And that first principle, prayer, every day ACN staff gather in our 23 offices throughout the world to pray for those who are persecuted for their faith or are in pastoral need. And we invite our benefactors through a number of our initiatives and events to join us in prayer as well. And the beneficiaries, the stories that come back from the ground on the churches throughout the world that ACN support, our beneficiaries are so grateful for our prayers, and they often share with us that they are in fact praying for our benefactors and us as a staff community on a daily basis as well. Our second principle is information. So each year we fund over 5,000 projects in more than 140 countries in our world, and we help to support the church in its mission and bringing hope and solidarity to millions of people throughout the world. We carry out our research and investigation in many countries where there is known persecution towards Christians and other faith minorities, of which you've heard this evening. Our report are the end results of this research. So please do look onto our website. I've sent some links through the share and read these case studies. Sign up for a copy of the report. It's free and we'll get that sent out to you. We have an e-news, which would be great if you would like to sign up. The information again is online for that, and keep up to date. Please become informed further. I know a lot of you are already very involved with ACN and we're really grateful for that, but please tell anyone that will listen to the plight of persecuted Christians and other faith minorities in our world. And finally, and most importantly, we ask you to take action. You are here tonight and you've already taken that action, so thank you. As part of this year's campaign, as we've mentioned, it is our petition, and we're calling for the government to take action to save Christians from genocidal violence in Nigeria. The ACN Break the Silence petition calls on the UK government specifically to exert pressure on Nigeria's political leaders to bring to justice those responsible for the genocidal attacks, many of which we've heard about this evening, the abductions and the other atrocities that are plaguing the country. John mentioned the number of Christians that have been killed, and I had that marked to say as well, 7,600 Christians have been killed within just 18 months, and a further 5,200 have been abducted. Last year alone, there were attacks on more than 400 churches and other Christian institutes within Nigeria. In theory, governments that sign up to the UN Declaration of Human Rights are guaranteeing religious freedom to their citizens, especially minority groups. But as we've heard tonight, this is often very different in practice, and many governments are indifferent to religious freedom, meaning that around the world, Christians in particular face harassment, discrimination, torture and often death, purely because of their faith. If you've not already done so, then please, we invite you to sign our petition and please share it on your social platforms and with your friends in any way that you can. Please write to your MSPs and MPs and invite them to sign the petition, and perhaps to your local media. We've mentioned this evening that it might be that you write to the media and you highlight our campaigns to share. Freedom to believe is a hugely undervalued and overlooked basic human right, and our Red Wednesday campaign at ACN aims to highlight this right and invite others to join us in using our voice to break the silence and to call for change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. I'm left with the final remarks this evening. Before I do that, I want to welcome John Mason, who has just popped up on my screen. I didn't realise my colleague John Mason, MSP, had joined us this evening, so I'm delighted that he's in the room with us too. And I hope that many more of my colleagues will meet with Aid to the Church in Need tomorrow at the drop-in that you're having in the Parliament. I'm sure it will be a really big success. Tonight, as always, on Red Wednesday, it's very moving and very thought-provoking when we're considering the plight of Christians and the hardship that people have, and the bravery and faith that they show in the face of the most unimaginable to me circumstances. So I want to thank everyone who's taken part this evening, who's been willing to share their very own experiences and the knowledge they've gained from the research with us this evening. And I'm sure that everyone will take away the call to action points, share that petition, do what they can to raise awareness and use their own networks to ensure that the Aid to the Church in Need is in people's thoughts and prayers at all time. And on that note, I think I can draw everything to a close this evening, and almost exactly on time, a little bit ahead of schedule, but a huge thank you to all of our presenters this evening, but also to everyone who has taken time out of our busy lives at this time of year to listen and to pay attention and think about the issues that have been laid before us this evening. So thank you, everyone. God bless and safe home.
Thank you.